This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley, Ruxton by Philip Verrill Mighels. Chapter 35. The Ice Blue Eyes. When Thurley awoke, the day-end sun was obliquely breaking through the clouds and storm and streaming coldly in at the window of a barren room, the features of which suggested the hazy continuance of an ugly dream. Her mind was dazed and uncertain. She was ill and faint. Only the dimmest shadows of memory came to restore the morning's occurrences. Vaporous ghosts of her last sensation at Edith's room haunted her half-illumined mind. She closed her eyes, vaguely convinced that she was lying in her bed and must soon arouse and prepare to go down to her work with Major Phipps. She felt she'd overslept, dreaming some wondrous experience like a modern fairy story, wherein she had almost been a princess, almost been... She opened her eyes again, feeling something strangely hard in her hand. It felt like a chain, but she did not immediately raise it, or raise her head to see. She was still too weak, too indifferent. The sunlight pained her eyes. What a strange room it was, after all, with its broken ceiling, its ragged walls, and the shattered chair and table. A pain went through her head as certain functions of her heart and blood resumed their normal ways. With a hurtful throb, a frightening memory surged through the dullness of her brain. She sat up suddenly, turning actively and staring with blazing eyes at a woman who sat upon a second bed a foot removed from her own. Confusion, rushes of blood to her brain, disordered recollections and new alarms plunged pell-mell into the cavities of her skull, congesting her brain with illness, pains, a tumult of thoughts and emotions. A sickening sense of revulsion overwhelmed all else momentarily as she recognized, but failed for a second to place, the eyes at which she was gazing. Then she knew them. Those poisonous ice-blue eyes, so intently fastened upon her that night in the horse-show box. A shudder of cold and weakness and disgust passed rapidly through her frame, for the woman smiled, and her smile was worse than her eyes. "Oh," said Thurley, as she sank on the pillow of the couch once more, racked by pains and haunting dread. "Come to at last," said Zagorski in German, her utterance one of sneering contempt. "Didn't know where you were at first, or how it happened. Think how you can pass the time guessing where you are and why you come." She laughed abominably. "It wouldn't be so comfortable and warm if I didn't have to stay in the room myself, I can tell you that. So thank your fortunate stars I am here." The vapours and ghosts of memory in Thurley's mind became real substance with painful clarity. All events of the morning crowded back in their sequence like a series of shocks, and again she felt herself being stifled and blotted from existence. She was wholly at loss to understand the situation or the reasons for anyone's attack upon herself, however, and found the woman here so utterly repellent that nameless fears were her portion. Once more she became aware that something foreign lay in the grasp of her hand. She drew the hard thing upward as she once more rose to a sitting position. It was a light steel chain secured to a girdle of similar metal fastened about her waist. She was still fully dressed, A new sense of chill went down her spine. "What does all this mean?" she said, her hand going up to her cheek and forehead. "What have I done to be chained here like an animal?" "You've been one," laughed the woman mirthlessly, "a pampered, pretty animal, useless if not even dangerous. If you have the brains to understand me, which is doubtful, and quite properly chained at last." The other end of the chain was fastened to the bed, which was of iron. This Thurley comprehended in one discerning glance. Half-formed fears of what it might all imply became inescapable dreads as she once more faced the poisonous light balefully gleaming in the woman's eyes. The sun ray was withdrawn as a cloud obscured the great cold orb, and a chilly draught that an odorous oil stove could neither dispel nor greatly modify swept like another inimical presence across the girl's warm cheek. "Have I ever harmed you?" she inquired, ill again with an intention that appeal, query, or reason would be wasted on this malignant-looking being. "Have I ever harmed any one at all?" "Harmed? Ha!" Thurley tried another tack. "Will you tell me where I am?" "Didn't I tell you to guess and occupy your mind?" All that Thurley could recall seemed very far away. She wondered how far it really was. She asked, "Is it permissible to inquire the time of day?" "Nearly 5 o'clock." "Thank you. Saturday?" "Saturday." Thoughts of Alice and how she might be worrying crept between the baffled conjectures, alarms, and turmoil in Thurley's brain, and aroused her to something approximating anger. "This is infamous," she said. "It was cowardly, inhuman." She remembered Edith. "You haven't brought Miss Steck here too, in her wretched condition?" The woman revelled in her captive's impotent warmth. "Miss Steck is still in Lakewood, useless to the cause." Thurley looked at her, puzzled alike by this statement concerning Edith and the reference to a cause, her active mind swiftly flashing from one speculation to another in her effort to fathom the feeling of animosity against herself which the woman manifestly harboured. "Still in Lakewood?" she repeated. "But her letter—" Oh! A dim and wavering light was vouchsafed her groping mentality. She comprehended first, in the somewhat hazy manner, that Edith had never written the letter, that a trap had been laid with Edith as the bait, that something lay behind it all too profound for immediate solution. It wove in fantastic, elusive forms about the masquerade, the belief of all New York that she was Princess Thurvinia. Yet why, even then, this clear, vivid memories of the woman's eyes at the horse show, this woman's chilling eyes, the intensity of her gaze, the hatred in her face, and the awe and creep she had then inspired, blazed up with singular intensity as if to reveal much more, but faded again and left the mystery black. She was tempted for a moment to cry out protestingly that she was not Princess Thurvinia, merely a poor Cinderella, granted an hour of butterfly existence from a life monotonously grey and dull before. But she banished the thought at once. She knew it would be so utterly in vain and futile. The story would not be credited. It would appear the merest childish subterfuge of anyone similarly situated, precisely what the real princess might attempt in hope of escape. Subconsciously aware that the chain and the woman's watchful presence argued unusual precautions against her escape, therefore unusual importance doubtless in her capture, and remembering also the Baron's request that she continue in her role, she was momentarily more and more convinced that something political lay behind the affair of which she was the victim. The Baron had said she might perform a great service to his country. Her fright gave way to thinking, planning impossible things, wondering why she was kept alive at all, speculating as to Baron von Hochhaus and how much he might have known of dangers surrounding the princess. Indignation succeeded a number of lesser emotions in her being, and yet she was weak and could not long retain anger adequate to the indignities here thrust upon her. What to do was the question, not what might have been done. Was escape by any means possible, chained as she was, and probably under the constant watchfulness of this icy-eyed woman who suggested some species of vampire yet unnamed? She sank on the pillow, ill again, in a slight degree from the reflex action of the drug employed to blanket her senses. She could think of little more clearly thus, and realized the uselessness of questioning the woman who would certainly reveal nothing of the slightest importance. The day was fast greying into gloom. She could see far out through the dirty panes of the window across the dreary landscape of denuded trees and snow. She had known it for open country at the first waking glance. The wind was swaying the trees, snow wraiths drifted homelessly across the desolation. There was not a house in sight. She looked about the wretched room on that particular side of the couch without a motion of her head, wondering just how far above the snow the earth was, the window. Her thoughts went straying off to Robley Stuyvesant involuntarily. Some way she felt that if she could only let him know where she was, he would come, though death itself should bar the way. She knew she would go to him in such a plight, and the thought warmed her heart like a flame of sacred fire. If she only knew where she was, if she only knew, if she could only tell him. Her secondary drowsiness overcame her, and she slept there like a child. It was less than an hour before she once more started to her senses, this time wide awake promptly and blinking at a smoky lamp on the rickety table near the wall. The windows were heavily curtained. Not a ray of light could have found its way to the outer darkness of the land. Two figures cast great shadows on the floor, one the woman's, the other a man's. The latter bore some steaming dishes in his hands, and on his arm with a waiter's universal skill. It was he they called Pelleven, an accomplished being with a mind, he always said, above the roles for which the world had cast him. At the slight sound made by Thurley in propping herself on an arm, the woman turned. "Get up," she commanded. "I am hungry. We dine." Thurley was staring at Pelleven, whose face was sure betokened better things than a questionable association with this woman. He did not turn, however, till he had placed all the dishes on the table. Then, as he went, he cast a look on the captive girl that seemed, she fancied, friendly, if not indeed compassionate, all while Zagorski's back was turned. "Will you drink tea or coffee?" asked the woman, arranging the dishes on the table. "You see, I am generous, a good provider." "Coffee, if you please," said Thurley, who trusted it might be as good as the bare suggestion promised. She was painfully hungry. She rose from the bed, discovering her chain to be fully 10 feet in length, even as the woman strode to the door and bawled to Pelleven to bring 2 cups of coffee. Then presently, with Zagorski seated close to her side, Thurley assuaged her appetite on mutton stew with bread and butter. The fare, though exceedingly limited as to variety, was nevertheless acceptable, being well cooked and comfortingly hot. The coffee in two large heavy cups was brought a few minutes later, and once more Pelivan disappeared. It seemed to Thurley utterly incongruous to sit here calmly eating with such a being under such conditions, but she was a healthy, hungry young woman, and to starve would be the greatest folly. Zagorski was not a communicative or loquacious person. Thurley felt that queries, entreatings, or demands would be alike wasted on the creature, and therefore, both being greatly in need of bodily sustenance, there was nothing said during the progress of the meal. The same inherent shrinking from the adventures was constantly present in Thurley's subconscious thoughts and movements, yet a sheer determination that she would not needlessly grieve or otherwise waste her strength possessed her absolutely, and supplied her with courage, hope, and a wisdom rare and helpful. When at length she pushed her empty cup away, there was new resolve and a steady renerving resentment in her being. She took one look at Madame Zagorski, almost as if with a thought in mind of pouncing upon her, fighting it out, and then perhaps leaping from the window. But the wild idea faded instantly, leaving her sober sense of throne and aware of the heavy odds against her. She rose from the table, and her angry glance, which was also girlishly wistful, sped along the twisted links of the chain that bound her to the bed. She almost started at the sight of a link supplied by strands of wire. The chain had either been broken, or two short pieces had once been spliced together, the wire being passed at least 4 times between the iron links, then twisted hard and nipped off close and bent down level with the strands. Thurley's breath came faster, merely with the thought of things perhaps made possible could she once but tamper with the link. Then Zagorski faced about, and Thurley sank on the edge of the bed with her eyes averted from the woman's. Despite all the sleep she had taken that day, she presently felt herself heavy again. She made an effort, at first rather slight, then more determined, to cast the feeling off. A few minutes later she was exerting the utmost will power and mental goading of which she was capable to divest her brain of the lethargy creeping upon it. The effort was in vain, her struggle impotent. She felt herself dimmed as by some heavy cloud expunging her life. With her last protesting lucubrations she realized that the drowsiness was wholly unnatural, and was helplessly certain the coffee had been drugged. With one despairing fear of what the night might bring upon her, a fear that fought but had not the force to battle down the narcotic, she felt herself drooping head downward on the bed, and was once more inert and unconscious. End of chapter 35.